You think pandemics are a modern fear, a 21st century problem, fought with vaccines and hospitals. But if you lived in early America, disease was the real ruler of your life. You wouldn't have to wait for war or famine to kill you. Invisible enemies already filled the air you breathed, the water you drank, and the people you loved. And you'd have no idea why. Welcome to early America, where every cough could mean death, and every handshake might be your last. Before we begin, take a breath, because by the end of this story, you might never look at life before medicine the same way again. Subscribe to uncover the forgotten horrors that built our world. Hit the bell so you never miss what history tried to bury. Imagine stepping off a ship in the 1600s, feeling the damp salt of the Atlantic clinging to your skin. You've best survived the voyage to the New World months, trapped in a rotting wooden coffin of a ship. You think you've made it to paradise, land, air, freedom. But in your lungs, something deadly is already growing. The moment settlers arrived, so did disease. Smallpox, measles, typhus, cholera, imported killers riding on breath, skin, and water. The Native Americans, who had lived here for thousands of years, had no immunity. And within a single generation, nearly 90% of them were gone. Entire villages vanished overnight. European diaries describe walking through forests littered with bones, entire towns reduced to silence, rivers clogged with corpses. We found not one living soul, one colonist wrote in horror after arriving at what used to be a thriving Wampanoag settlement. Only the skulls of men and women staring from the weeds. You wouldn't survive this place. Because the most terrifying thing wasn't how fast people died. It was that no one understood why. Disease was thought to be divine punishment, or foul air, or witchcraft. Doctors bled patients until they fainted, rubbed mercury on their skin, or forced them to vomit until they collapsed. If you developed smallpox, and you likely would, your body would erupt in fire. The pustules would start on your tongue and throat, filling your mouth with pus, sealing your voice away. You'd choke on your own sickness before the fever even broke. Those who lived long enough to scar were considered blessed. For the colonists, smallpox was an old enemy. But for Native Americans, it was something worse. It was apocalypse. The 1633 outbreak along the Massachusetts coast was one of the deadliest in recorded history. It began with one sailor, a sick child aboard an English ship bound for Boston. Within weeks, it swept across tribal lines. Warriors, mothers, chiefs, all dead within days. By winter, half the population of New England's indigenous people had perished. Some Englishmen believed it was divine proof that God favored them. "The Lord hath cleared the land for us," one Puritan minister declared. But for survivors, it was a waking nightmare. Fields lay unharvested, entire tribes disappeared, and the balance of the continent shifted forever. Smallpox wasn't the only killer. In the filthy streets of early American cities, another monster grew, yellow fever. In the summer of 1793, Philadelphia was the capital of the United States, a city of wealth and promise. Then mosquitoes arrived. Within days, people began vomiting black bile, bleeding from their eyes, dying in doorways. Corpses piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried. Panic spread faster than the fever. The wealthy fled the city. The poor were trapped. Doctors disagreed on the cause. Bad air, spoiled coffee, divine wrath. George Washington himself fled the city, abandoning the government to chaos. You'd hear the bell of the death cart before you saw it. The iron wheels dragging over cobblestone, the driver shouting, "Bring out your dead." By October, 1/10 of Philadelphia was gone. Entire families wiped out. Children wandering the streets alone. The smell of death was everywhere, wrote one survivor. But the cruelest truth? It could have been prevented if anyone had known it was carried by mosquitoes. Out on the frontier, things were worse. The settlers pushed westward, building towns along rivers that became breeding grounds for cholera, the Blue Death. Imagine waking up one morning to find your neighbor vomiting until their skin turned gray. Within hours, they were gone. Cholera could kill in 6 hours flat. And the smell, a sweet, sickly odor that stuck to your clothes, your hair, your dreams. In 1832, it swept through the Mississippi Valley like a ghost army. Steamboats became floating coffins. Towns burned their docks to keep travelers away, but it was already too late. Doctors wore beak-like masks stuffed with herbs, thinking they could filter out the disease. It was useless. Cholera spread through water, but no one believed that yet. Every well was poison. Every sip was a gamble. If you survived one epidemic, you'd likely be caught by another. Typhus, malaria, dysentery, all thrived where humans gathered. But the most devastating were the silent carriers. Diseases that didn't kill right away, but crippled for life. Polio twisted spines and paralyzed limbs. Tuberculosis hollowed out lungs. Consumption, they called it, because it consumed you slowly until your breath came out in bloody mist. You wouldn't survive the winter, and you wouldn't be buried with dignity either. Mass graves were the norm. No coffins, no prayers, just trenches filled with the dead. But disease didn't only destroy bodies, it rewrote history. Epidemics decided wars, shaped migrations, and determined who lived to build America's future. The smallpox epidemic of 1775 devastated the Continental Army. George Washington, once infected himself, realized the truth. The war for independence could be lost not to the British, but to a virus. He secretly ordered mass inoculations, the first of their kind. Soldiers were deliberately infected with a milder form of smallpox, risking their lives for immunity. Many died, but the gamble worked. Washington's army survived. America was born on the edge of biological catastrophe. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans were dying in even greater numbers. On plantations, disease spread through the air, through sweat, through cruelty. Malaria and yellow fever thrived in the warm southern swamps. Enslaved people were often blamed for spreading disease, even as they were forced to work in the very conditions that bred it. Doctors performed horrific experiments on them, believing black bodies felt less pain. When epidemics struck, enslaved communities were abandoned. No medicine, no mercy. But what truly makes early America's epidemics so disturbing is this. The people who survived didn't just endure, they adapted. They learned to use disease as a weapon. British officers during the French and Indian War reportedly distributed smallpox-infected blankets to native tribes, one of the earliest documented cases of biological warfare. What had once been divine punishment was now a tool of conquest. The land itself became infected. And yet, in the ashes of all this suffering, something remarkable began. From fear came science. From death came discovery. American doctors began experimenting with inoculation, sanitation, quarantine. Towns started building hospitals, setting up pest houses outside their borders. Benjamin Rush, though often wrong, pioneered ideas about contagion that would evolve into modern epidemiology. The cemeteries of early America became laboratories of progress. But for every discovery, there were 1,000 forgotten graves. If you stood in an early American cemetery today, you might see the same thing written over and over on the weathered stones. Taken by fever, died of flux, lost to the pox. These weren't just statistics, they were the bones of history. So the next time you hear about a modern pandemic, remember, we faced far worse, and we survived barely. But you wouldn't have. You've survived the first wave. Barely. Your neighbors are gone. The church bells have stopped ringing. The silence outside your cabin feels heavier than the fever in your bones. You're one of the lucky ones, if you can call it that. But as you lie there, sweating through the night, you realize something. No one knows how to help you. Because in early America, medicine was guesswork. There were no hospitals as we know them today. No antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria. The best trained doctors of the colonies believed disease came from miasma, bad air, rising from swamps and rotting matter. So when fever struck, they opened windows, burned herbs, and bled the patient until their skin turned gray. They called it heroic medicine. You'd call it torture. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, the most respected American physician was Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and the man who helped lead Philadelphia through the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. But Rush's methods were brutal. He believed sickness came from excess blood, corrupting the system. His cure? Bleed the patient until they fainted. Some lost over 2 quarts of blood in a single sitting. Others were purged with mercury-laced pills called colonial, which stripped the lining of their stomachs and teeth. The streets outside Rush's clinic filled with bodies. But to him, their deaths were proof the disease was too strong, not that his treatment was poison. If you were unlucky enough to be his patient, you'd likely die faster than the fever could kill you. Elsewhere, folk healers and midwives tried their own cures: roots, charms, poultices, and prayers. Some mixed tobacco with ashes to draw out infection. Others pressed onions to the skin or hung garlic over the bed. And in their own way, they were closer to the truth than the doctors. Because while physicians clung to theory, the poor and enslaved relied on observation. What worked? African herbal traditions, Native American remedies, and women's domestic medicine quietly saved lives while science stumbled in the dark. But in a cruel twist, those same healers were often accused of witchcraft. If a child recovered after a woman brewed him tea, it was unnatural. If a fever broke after a charm, it was the devil's work. Women were punished, shamed, or even executed for knowing more about healing than the men in power. Quarantine became America's next desperate weapon. By the late 1700s, cities like Boston and New York built pest houses on the edge of town, grim stone buildings surrounded by fences, where the sick were locked away. They were called isolation hospitals, but really they were death traps. If you caught smallpox or yellow fever, you'd be dragged there, sometimes against your will. Families were torn apart, mothers separated from children, doors nailed shut with red crosses painted over them. Inside, there were no real doctors, only attendants who feared infection. Patients lay in straw, screaming through fever, while priests whispered last rites from the doorway. At night, you'd hear the coughing, the crying, and then silence. No one came out. But not everyone feared infection. Some saw it as an opportunity. In 1721, smallpox returned to Boston. The city was paralyzed with terror until an unlikely voice spoke up. Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister, often blamed for the Salem witch trials. He had learned something extraordinary from an enslaved man named Onesimus, who told him that in Africa, people were protected from smallpox by deliberately infecting themselves with a weaker version, a process called inoculation. Mather proposed trying it in Boston. The public was outraged. Newspapers called it satanic. One mob even threw a bomb through his window. But Mather persisted. Doctors tested inoculation on volunteers, and it worked. The death rate dropped from 1 in 6 to 1 in 50. It was one of the first scientific medical breakthroughs in American history, and it came not from Europe, but from African knowledge. Still, inoculation was terrifying. You'd be cut on the arm, and pus from an infected person would be rubbed into the wound. The hope was that your body would build resistance before the disease overwhelmed you. You'd spend weeks in isolation, trembling with fever, praying your gamble worked. Many didn't survive. But enough did that, the practice spread. By the time of the American Revolution, George Washington made it mandatory for his soldiers. The same weapon that once wiped out indigenous tribes now helped America win independence. But while some diseases were finally being understood, others continued their quiet massacre. In the filthy cities of the 1800s, tuberculosis, consumption, became the great American killer. It didn't strike like cholera or smallpox. It crept in slowly, stealing years instead of days. You'd cough blood into a handkerchief and hide it, ashamed. You'd grow thinner, paler, weaker. Doctors told you to seek fresh air, so patients were sent to sanatoriums high in the mountains, vast white buildings surrounded by pine forests, where they slept on open balconies even in the snow. They called it a cure, but most never came back. At night, the halls echoed with the sound of coughing, hundreds of lungs gasping in rhythm, a symphony of dying breath. By mid-century, cholera struck again. This time, it hit New York City. In July 1832, an immigrant ship brought the disease from Europe. Within weeks, panic turned the city into chaos. Doctors fled. Priests refused to perform funerals. Thousands were dumped into mass graves. The government's response? Denial. Officials insisted the rich were immune, that cholera only killed the filthy and immoral. The poor, mostly Irish immigrants, were blamed for their own deaths. Newspapers called it the wages of vice. Meanwhile, cholera continued to rip through the tenements, feeding on the city's ignorance. If you'd lived there, you'd smell death before you saw it, a sour metallic stench rising from every alley. You'd avoid the water pump, but you wouldn't know that the pump was the killer all along. It would take decades, and scientists like John Snow in England, to prove that cholera spread through contaminated water. By then, millions were gone. In the South, epidemics took on a different face. Yellow fever ravaged New Orleans again and again, each summer claiming thousands. The city's tropical heat, swamps, and slave markets made it the perfect breeding ground. Families painted the word fever in chalk on their doors to warn others away. The wealthy fled to the countryside. The poor stayed behind to die. Some doctors noticed that newly arrived immigrants died quickly, while locals survived. They called it acclimation. We'd call it immunity. But they didn't know that yet. Every outbreak brought the same terror, the same rush to flee, the same haunting silence after. New Orleans, one visitor wrote, smells of death and perfume. And through it all, religion shaped how Americans understood disease. Ministers preached that illness was punishment for sin. Revivalists promised healing through prayer. Some believed epidemics were signs of the end times. In a world without antibiotics, faith was medicine. But faith could also kill. During outbreaks, fanatics refused treatment, choosing to let God decide. Others formed healing cults, mixing scripture with quackery, selling holy water, plague amulets, or secret powders that did nothing but poison. The desperate believed them, and many paid with their lives. By the late 1800s, science finally began to pull ahead. The discovery of germs changed everything. Bacteria were no longer invisible curses. They were living things that could be seen, studied, and fought. Public health laws followed. Cities began building sewers. Streets were cleaned. Water was filtered. The first vaccines appeared. But progress came at a cost. The new medical establishment demanded authority and erased the old ways that had quietly worked for centuries. Women healers, indigenous herbalists, and African doctors were pushed out. Dismissed as superstition, medicine became professional and white. By the dawn of the 20th century, America had transformed. The days of smallpox and cholera were fading, but the scars they left in graves, in laws, in memory still shape us. Because these epidemics weren't just medical disasters. They were social earthquakes. They determined who lived, who ruled, and who vanished. They decided what kind of country America would become. But what if I told you the story didn't end there? By the dawn of the 20th century, America told itself it had conquered disease. Smallpox had been tamed. Cholera was fading. Science was triumphant. But underneath that confidence was a new kind of sickness, one not of the body, but of the mind. Because when you start believing you can control life and death, it's only a matter of time before you try to control people too. The story of America's medical progress is also the story of who got sacrificed along the way. At the turn of the century, scientists and politicians were obsessed with cleanliness, not just of the streets, but of society itself. Immigrants were flooding into Ellis Island. Millions came from Italy, Poland, Russia, and China. They brought their languages, their gods, their food, and to many Americans, their diseases. Doctors began linking illness to race, poverty to biology. The same theories that once blamed cholera on bad air now blamed entire ethnic groups for being unfit. That's when a new movement began, eugenics. It promised to improve the human race, to breed out sickness, criminality, and madness. But behind its polished language was something monstrous. Because eugenics wasn't medicine. It was social engineering with a scalpel. Across the country, state fairs held better baby contests. Families competed to see whose children had the most perfect features, like livestock at auction. Doctors published charts ranking races by intelligence. Politicians warned that feeble-minded people were breeding too fast. Newspapers described sterilization as a public duty. And so, between 1907 and the 1960s, more than 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized. They were poor women, black women, Native American girls, people in asylums, prisoners, orphans. Most never even knew what was being done to them. A doctor would tell them they needed an appendix operation or a routine procedure. They'd wake up barren, their futures stolen in the name of public health. Some states kept records. Most did not. One of the most infamous cases began in Virginia, 1927. A young woman named Carrie Buck was accused of being feeble-minded after giving birth to a child conceived through rape. The state decided she, her mother, and her baby were all unfit, so they chose to sterilize her. She fought back, but the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and America's highest judges approved it. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes delivered the chilling words that still echo today. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. With that sentence, eugenics became law, and thousands more were sterilized under the banner of science and morality. While America was performing surgeries in secret, another form of medical progress was unfolding in laboratories and military camps. During the World Wars, the government saw soldiers not just as defenders, but as test subjects. They were exposed to mustard gas, injected with experimental vaccines, even made to stand in freezing chambers to test survival times. In 1942, the U.S. began a malaria experiment on prisoners in Illinois. Over 400 men were infected, so scientists could study the disease. They were promised shorter sentences. Most never recovered fully. And yet, what followed was worse. After World War II, America learned about Nazi medical atrocities, the freezing tests, the poison gas trials, the deadly surgeries. The world swore it would never happen again. But even as the Nuremberg trials condemned Nazi doctors, American institutions were running their own horrific studies, quietly, methodically, right at home. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began tracking the Tuskegee syphilis study, a 40-year experiment on poor black men in Alabama. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, but they weren't treated at all. Even after penicillin was discovered, the cure, doctors withheld it. Hundreds died slow, agonizing deaths, so researchers could observe the natural course of the disease. Their wives were infected. Their children were born with congenital syphilis. The government knew and let it continue until 1972. 40 years of betrayal, hidden under the name of science. And Tuskegee wasn't the only one. In the 1940s, U.S. scientists infected prisoners and mental patients in Guatemala with syphilis and gonorrhea without consent to test new antibiotics. Many died, and the story was buried for decades. In the 1950s, the CIA launched Project MKUltra, experimenting with LSD, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation, often on unsuspecting civilians, to see if they could control the human mind. Even hospitals weren't safe. Mental patients, soldiers, orphans, anyone deemed powerless could become a test subject overnight. The justification was always the same, for the greater good. But if you look closer, it wasn't just science that drove these horrors. It was fear. The same fear that had haunted America since the epidemics began. Fear of the unclean, the unfit, the foreign, the uncontrollable. Disease had taught the country that survival meant control. Control the body, control the population, control the future. That mindset shaped everything, from immigration laws to housing, from marriage licenses to who was allowed to have children. And the victims were always the same. The poor, the marginalized, the powerless. By the mid-20th century, the language had changed, but the logic hadn't. Public health became about prevention. Slums were demolished in the name of sanitation. People were institutionalized for moral hygiene. Native American children were sent to boarding schools to cleanse them of their culture. The same ideology dressed in white coats instead of uniforms. America's obsession with purity had simply evolved. And in a haunting way, the epidemics of the past had prepared the ground for it. Because when your ancestors have watched entire towns vanish overnight, when death has stalked every family tree, you start believing survival must be earned or enforced. But not everyone accepted it. By the 1960s and 70s, journalists, whistleblowers, and activists began uncovering the truth. The Tuskegee study was exposed. Victims of forced sterilization spoke out. Civil rights leaders demanded reforms. The outrage was global. The world saw what progress had cost. And slowly, painfully, America began to reckon with itself. New ethical codes were created. Informed consent became law. Institutional review boards were formed to protect subjects. But the damage couldn't be undone. Generations of trauma were already written into history, hidden in files stamped classified and confidential. Today, when a new virus appears, we trust that medicine will save us. We look to science for answers, to vaccines, to data. And most of the time, it does. But behind every breakthrough lies a graveyard of forgotten names. The ones who suffered were silenced or erased so that others could live. It's a legacy America still carries. A shadow stretching from the colonial pest houses to the fluorescent lights of modern hospitals. The same question lingers. How much human suffering is society willing to justify in the name of progress? Maybe that's the true epidemic, the belief that survival makes us righteous. The diseases that once terrified early America are mostly gone now. But the fear that built our systems, the control that shaped our medicine, the arrogance that turned healing into power, those remain. Every syringe, every policy, every miracle cure still carries the echo of the past. The bleeding bowl, the locked ward, the whispered prayer over a dying child. Because the story of American medicine isn't just about how we conquered disease. It's about how disease conquered us, how it infected our morals, our politics, and our vision of what it means to be human. And maybe the real cure is remembering.